And so along with Beatrice, they move from the sphere of the sun to the sphere of Mars. The ascent to Mars is captured by Doré in this scene because Beatrice, she is still her individual self, and she desires to participate with the souls in Mars who are so brilliantly bright. And as she participates in their existence, Dante is there watching as this happens, and he is again brought to an emotional wreck looking at the beauty of Beatrice, because the closer and closer that they get to the center of Paradiso, Beatrice just becomes more and more radiant and beautiful, and it becomes more difficult for Dante to digest. It becomes difficult for him to contemplate the beauty of her. And so you see a little bit of it in this image. And so what happens when they get to the sphere of Mars? Now, Mars has always been associated with the god of war. Mars was the god of war. It's red, it's passionate, it's fiery. And so we've moved past the cardinal virtues, and we've moved into the final three virtues that are the most important virtues. That above all else, these virtues are the entire meaning of life and happiness, and these are the theological virtues. And Mars, and the souls that exist on Mars, embody the first of the three theological virtues, and that is the theological virtue of faith. Now, faith requires you to be passionate and on fire for what you believe, which is the association with the passion and the fire of the planet Mars and the god of war. And so the souls here are growing in their virtue of faith. This is best exemplified in this scene that Doré captures in one of his illustrations. All of these magnificent and brilliant souls are existing together in the form of a cross. Because the faith of heaven, the faith of paradise, is based on what happened on the cross. Christianity is based on the imagery of the cross. The cross is the most important image that Christians have. And the cross is the perfect embodiment and the perfect example of faith. It was the faith of Christ and the love that he had for his people that led him to the cross. And at the same time, that cross is still used even today as a sign of our faith. Before and after every prayer, we begin and end with the sign of the cross. There is a cross and a crucifix in every single room of high school. And in any Catholic building, there will be a crucifix in every single room. The cross is the ultimate symbol of faith. And so, for Dante, this is the perfect embodiment of this passionate faith that the souls on Mars inhabitate for. And we get one of the neatest moments in all of Paradiso. Dante encounters an ancestor of his named Cacciaguida. Now, in Doré's vision of what this scene was, Cacciaguida kind of looks like Sauron from Lord of the Rings. But Cacciaguida was a crusader. I think he participated in the Second Crusade. But again, an ancestor of Dante. And as a person who lived his life for his faith, he was a crusader. And as someone who is connected to Dante in a familial way, he tells Dante two important things. One, he's going to tell him something that will happen to him. He tells Dante, you are going to be exiled from Florence. Florence is an evil place right now, and you're going to be exiled from it. And that actually happens in the story, in Dante's life. Again, he's writing all of this after his exile, but he's saying that Cacciaguida warned him that this was going to happen. And then finally, Cacciaguida is the first person to tell Dante Listen, when you get back to Earth, after you've toured Inferno, Purgatorio, Paradiso, I want you to start writing down what you have seen. And so Cacciaguida, for the first time in this scene, tells Dante, you're going to write the Divine Comedy. So Dante and Beatrice move from the sphere of Mars to the sphere of Jupiter. Now, Jupiter is associated with the king of the gods, and so the individuals who exist on this sphere are the individuals who were just rulers who practiced justice to its fullest extent when they were alive. In this image from Gustave Doré, you see the just souls moving around Dante and Beatrice, and there's something that I want you to notice at this point. As we move further and further away from Earth, the souls become more uniform. They become far less individual. They form shapes and figures. You can't pinpoint necessarily individuals anymore. Definitely not in the images, and certainly not in the literature and the writing. There's a really important scene that we're going to approach in a second that further exemplifies this, but I want to tell you some of the souls that exist in this sphere before we do that, just to give you a shape of who Dante thinks were just rulers while they were alive. There are people like King David, who are the obvious ones, Constantine, the emperor who legalized Christianity, but there's someone really interesting that he includes here. He includes the Emperor Trajan. Now, Trajan, if you know anything about Roman history, Trajan was a Roman emperor who existed after Jesus, who, by all accounts from historians, he is considered a very good ruler. However, he was not Christian himself, and many Christians were martyred under his reign. However, Dante includes him in the story because, for a couple of reasons. One, he thinks that he was a ruler who valued justice above all else. But two, there was a legend while Dante was alive, that Trajan converted to Christianity. Now, there's no historical basis for that, but Dante decides to include a pagan in one of the highest spheres of paradise. So this gets us into a very interesting scene that further exemplifies this idea of the souls acting as one rather than as individuals. Together, all of the souls that exist in the sphere of Jupiter come together and form the spelling of a couple of words in Latin, and those words are Diligite Justitiam qui judicatis terram, which I guess you could translate it as you should love justice. Everyone who lives on Earth, or who rules on Earth. I think I got that translation correct. Love justice, those of you who rule on Earth. Now, pay attention to that phrase, Diligite Justitiam qui judicatis terram. It ends with an M. Now, all those souls that formed the rest of those letters sort of fly off, and all of those souls that form that last M stay. And so, Dante and Beatrice are watching this M in the middle of the sky, and slowly those M's form into an eagle. But not just any eagle, an imperial eagle. Now, if you know anything about Rome and the Roman Empire, the symbol of Rome was an imperial eagle. It was the sign of the empire. It was a sign of royalty and monarchy, and it was a sign of victory, and it was what led the Roman armies into battle. It was the most important symbol for Rome. So the fact that we are seeing this imperial eagle on this sphere tells us something. We should be thinking about royalty and divinity right now. we should be thinking about a heavenly king right now. Clearly, we should be thinking about Jesus, especially the Jesus who was killed by the very culture that utilized this imperial eagle and turned it on its head, and eventually overcame and overpowered that culture and that empire. Christianity overtook Rome. And so this is all of these are signs, are visualizations that are pointing to our eventual encounter with Jesus. Dante and Beatrice move on from the sphere of Jupiter up to the sphere of Saturn. And the people that exist here are one of the closest groups of people to the very center of paradise. And so there must be something about the lifestyle of these individuals that's very significant and very holy. But in order to understand who's here, what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to think back to our sophomore theology classes, specifically the spring semester. There's a group of people within the church who lived very unique lives, and they still exist today. We call them contemplatives. They choose to separate themselves from the rest of society, to live a life focused on only two things: prayer and work. Today, we usually call them monks and nuns, but the catch-all term that we can use is contemplatives. They've lived in monasteries, they lived in convents. Their lives are dedicated only to the service of God. And very often what happens with these individuals who live in these communities is they spend most of their days working on something, whatever that may be. Maybe it's doing woodworking, maybe that's making beer or bread or candy, anything to allow them to sustain themselves. And with all the free time that they have, they dedicate it to prayer. These are the individuals that inhabitate the sphere of Saturn. And the reason why they inhabit this sphere is because they fully embody and they have perfected the virtue of temperance. They know what is good for them, they know what is bad for them, and they treat their entire life as balance. Now we look at the life of a monk, or we look at the life of a nun, and we say that looks awful, that looks horrible. And yet, time and time again, consistently, they are usually the happiest and most satisfied people in the world, because they've prioritized what is necessary in life. They don't need material goods. They don't need to have fun all the time. But they enjoy their service to God. And that's where they get their enjoyment. That's where they get their fulfillment, their satisfaction in life. And so these are the souls that inhabit this sphere. Dante only knows that they've entered this new sphere because things are becoming a little bit more confusing for him. They're not as clear as they once were at the beginning of Paradiso. He knows that they're at a new level because Beatrice is no longer smiling. And Dante asks her why is she no longer smiling, and she says, well, listen, you've hardly been able to handle how beautiful and radiant I am up to this point. Now we are so far up in Paradiso. Now we are so close to God that if I were to smile, my radiance and my splendor would turn you to ashes. So she protects Dante from her own beauty in this scene, because the place that they are in is so holy and so perfect. Now, there's something really important that I want you to remember from our discussions from past quarters. Beatrice is the personification of theology. And so the closer that we get to God, and the clearer our theology becomes, the more radiant Beatrice becomes. Theology is nearly perfected in the contemplatives in the contemplative orders. And so Beatrice, as the study of theology, is so radiant in this specific location because she is so close to the perfection of God at this moment. Beatrice tells Dante, I want you to look into my eyes, and as you look into my eyes, you will see what is to come. And so Dante, as much as he can't take it, and as much as the beauty of Beatrice is tormenting him, he looks into her eyes, and he sees an image of a ladder that is ascending up into an unknown, into the unknown. And on this ladder are thousands and thousands of souls ascending upwards. Now, this should tell you that we're moving to something more special than where we have been up to this point. So Beatrice tells Dante, this is where we're going. Get ready. Dante and Beatrice climb this ladder, and they get to the 8th sphere. And this is what we call the sphere of the fixed stars. So when you look out into the night sky, you see the planets. They tend to just look like very big stars. And you see the moon. But then there are all of these smaller stars that seem fixed in the sky. And this is where we find constellations. This is where we find, astronomy and all of these things. They're fixed in the sky, and we can expect them there. Dante says that this is the sphere of the church triumphant. These stars, the last place where Dante really is going to find himself, the last place that any mere human being can find themselves, is this location of pure constancy. Everything is constant. Everything is triumphant. The church has won over sin and death, and highs and lows, and ebbs and flows, and waxing and waning. The church is constant, and it is triumphant. And so every soul that he sees here is going to be part of that church triumphant. So Dante looks back as he stands amongst the stars. And he looks back at where he started, and he sees the earth. And he's amazed at how small it is. He explains this scene. My eyes returned through all the 7 spheres and saw this globe in such a way that I smiled at its scrawny image. I approve that judgment has the best, which holds this earth to be the least, and he whose thoughts are set elsewhere can truly be called virtuous. The earth is so small, so humble, and yet everything that Dante is looking back on through this image, all of it stems from this one place that he began. So who are the people that he encounters in this most important sphere? These are individuals who embody the theological virtues of faith, of hope, and most importantly of love. He finds all of the saints. Most importantly, he finds the Virgin Mary. But he encounters a figure that's going to test him. A figure that, when we think of images of heaven, we always think of the pearly gates. And who's at the entrance of the pearly gates? It's Peter. Peter is considered to have the keys of the kingdom. He's given the keys of the kingdom by Jesus in the Gospels, whatever that means. And so any artist's interpretation of heaven is going to have Peter standing outside the gates of heaven, allowing people into heaven. Dante's image of heaven is no different. But instead of there being gates to heaven, Peter is near the very end of heaven, the very end of paradise. And he asks Dante 2 questions. 1, what is faith? And 2, do you have faith? Peter asks Dante, then, after Dante replies, Peter asks Dante, how do you know that the Bible and everything in the Bible is true? And Dante actually quotes one of the most important figures in my class, the patron saint of theology itself, Augustine. And so if you want to know the answer to this question that Peter asks, how do you know that the gospel and the things written in the Bible are true? Here is Augustine's response. Here's Dante's response. Look at Christianity. Now, there is no doubt that Jesus was a true human person who actually existed, and he clearly had followers when he was alive, because he was put to death. He was well known. He wasn't, waved off as some lunatic. He was considered influential. Now, the entire basis of Christianity is based on the idea that he can win over death, and he can rise from the dead, and he can overcome God's chosen people's enemies, which at the time were the Romans. All of those things happened, and all of those things happened with such humble beginnings. No Christian was powerful. No early Christian was powerful. None of them were famous. None of them were wealthy. They were all essentially redneck Middle Easterners. They were fishermen. They were home builders. And yet, for whatever reason, any time that their claims were challenged, any times that they were attempted to be suppressed, that their beliefs were made illegal, that they were put to death for what they believed in, it just grew stronger and stronger. Dante calls this the miracle of humble beginnings. If Christianity were not true, why is it that every time it's challenged, and why is it that every single time that it is tried to be eradicated throughout history, this is not just at the beginning of history, this has been found throughout world history. It's happening right now in areas such as Syria and Iraq. Why is it that the church becomes even stronger in those moments? So Dante moves from St. Peter to the next individual who tests him, and that is St. James. St. James questions Dante on the theological virtue of hope. He says, "Do you have hope?" And before Dante can even respond, Beatrice steps in and says, "I can speak on his behalf. I can tell you firsthand, I know that he has hope. From the beginning of Paradiso to this moment, I've traveled every step with him, and his heart has been filled with hope." And so Dante and Beatrice move on from St. James, and he encounters the last of the apostles, who is going to test him on the greatest of the theological virtues, the whole purpose of existence itself. He encounters St. John, and St. John asks him about love. This scene is depicted in Doré's illustration here, as you can see. The figure in the center may look like Jesus, but that is St. John, and he's asking Dante about his love. And in his response to St. John, Dante refers back to something that he mentioned in Purgatory and something that we mentioned in class. If you remember, when we mapped out Purgatorio, there's that tiny little sliver on the side of your page. It was meant to show the twisted form of love that can be found in the 7 deadly sins. Now it seems that when we sin, we are trying to pursue something good. And yet because of our twisted form of love, it prevents us from achieving that goodness. And so Dante refers back to those twisted loves that we wrote in that tiny little sliver. His entire journey from that first scene where he's trying to ascend a mountain and he's stopped by those three animals, up to this point in the story, he's looked back on his life on Earth and he's realized that everything that's been guiding him has been that tiny little sliver. It's been those twisted loves. It's been these loves with good intention, but have led him astray because it's not true love. And so he tells John, there's no way I could have answered this question if you had asked me before this journey. But through my descent into the pits of hell, and through coming up through Mount Purgatory and ascending through the space of paradise, I've realized what love is. And love is in the sacrifice that Jesus gave on the cross. And everything else simply is an offshoot of that. He says that Christ and God incarnate is the gardener. And through this act of gardening, this act of sacrifice, he created this massive garden in which life springs up in every corner. And love, authentic love, true love, spreads and grows up from the ground wherever your eyes can rest. And it was all because of this one divine gardener going through and gardening through this act of self-sacrificial love. So Dante is tested on faith, hope, and love by the apostles. And through his responses, he makes it clear that this journey has taught him the truth of faith, hope, and love. And so how does he end this lesson? What are his final thoughts? The current pope has totally bastardized this message. And as far as he sees it, the throne of St. Peter is empty. Now the choirs of angels at this moment begin singing the Gloria. And the souls that have guided him at this moment, Peter, James, John, Beatrice, they all glow bright before Dante. And all of a sudden, St. Peter changes his color. He was glowing bright white, but now he's glowing red. And Dante is so shocked that the choir of angels stopped their singing. But Peter explains, I am Peter. I am the vicar of Christ. And the Pope is my successor. He's the one that has my job. And the current Pope at this moment in history is doing a terrible job of this. He's so corrupt that Peter believes that the papacy is vacant. And so Peter's expression of this is through his brightness. And all of a sudden, the bright red of St. Peter begins to spread into the sky, and so now the entire sky is bright red, as if it were a sunset. And Beatrice also becomes bright red. Dante explains that it's almost as if she's embarrassed of what's going on. And St. Peter says again, the blood of the popes, the good popes, and his blood, or again, Peter was martyred, the blood was spilled for the church. It was not spilled for money. And they don't want to see money take over the papacy. Now, this is a very strange way to leave this final sphere of earthly existence, or not earthly, but humanly existence, but they do. Beatrice tells Dante to look back on Earth, and so he does, and immediately they start ascending to the next level. And the next level is what Dante calls the primum mobile. This is not where humans are meant to live. This is where the angels live. Remember, the angels are between the divine and human forms. And so they have their own place in heaven that they exist, and that is the primum mobile. And so as Dante is going through this sphere, the primum mobile, he sees the heavenly hosts. He sees these different levels of angels. And the way the angels are described, they are not... Now, if you look at Duré's image, they look like typical angels, but angels... I never went into this in class, but angels are very weird beings, and there are many different types of angels. I'm going to put up a classification list of the different types of angels, just to give you an idea of what the different angels look like and what they are, and how they reside in the primum mobile, and you're going to find that they're very weird and strange things. Very theological, but they don't make a lot of sense through a story form or through a visual form. But just look at these images, look at these different types of angels, and you'll see the different forms of beings that exist in the primum mobile. So Dante and Beatrice finally reach the very end of Paradiso, the last sphere, and it's the sphere that he calls the Empyrean. When they reach this sphere, Beatrice has grown so beautiful that Dante says he is now defeated. This is the best explanation, or the best description of the beauty of Beatrice that Dante gives in the entire Divine Comedy. And so I'll read to you some of the way that he describes this moment. So did the triumph that forever plays around the point that overcame me, point that seems enclosed by that which it encloses, fade gradually from my sight, so that my seeing nothing else, and love, compelled my eyes to turn again to Beatrice. If that which has been said of her so far were all contained within a single praise, it would be much too scant to serve me now. The loveliness I saw surpassed not only our human measure, and I think that surely only its maker can enjoy it fully. I yield. I am defeated at this passage more than a comic or a tragic poet has ever been by a barrier in his theme. For like the sun that strikes the frailest eyes, so does the memory of her sweet smile deprive me of the use of my own mind. From that first day when in this life I saw her face, until I had this vision, nothing ever cut the sequence of my song. But now I must desist from this pursuit in verses of her loveliness, just as each artist who has reached his limit must. If a mere human can grow to such radiance and beauty in the Empyrean, you know we have reached the pinnacle of perfection and beauty and goodness that exists. So beautiful is this place, in fact, that Dante is actually distracted from Beatrice. And what he lays his eyes on is what we see in this illustration from Gustave Doré. This is by far and away, my favorite visualization of heaven. If this is what heaven looks like, I would be completely content. What we see here is described by Dante as a celestial rose. We are looking at a rose. And this rose has different parts to it. There are souls that encircle it. And standing next to him is Beatrice, and they look into the center of the rose. And the center is so bright and radiant that you cannot focus on what exists within that center. But don't worry, we'll get there. Before Dante knows it, Beatrice has left him, and she's gone back to her place in the celestial rose. Because all of these souls that are circling are like bees spreading in the same way that bees collect pollen and spread it and create honey. These bees are collecting love and spreading love all around the celestial rose. And she participates in that. And so there's somebody that replaces her as Dante's guide for the end of the journey. And this is Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. He's the founder of the Cistercian orders. Cistercians were very formative to my own education. I was taught by Cistercian monks at the University of Dallas. And it's this story that, sort of embodies my relationship with the Cistercians. And so the fact that St. Bernard is the one who leads Dante at this very end is just a perfect encapsulation of an ending to the story. So St. Bernard takes Dante, and they began to move further into the celestial rose. And slowly but surely, Dante steps closer and closer to the center of the celestial rose until he is face to face with God himself. What does God look like? Dante describes what he sees as three circles of light, all existing in the same dimension. Now clearly, this refers to the Trinity. One circle is the Father, one circle is the Son, and one circle is the Holy Spirit. But all together, these three circles of light, all existing in the same dimension, focus their entire brilliance and their entire energy into the center of the circle. And in the center of the circle is the figure, the human form of Christ. Now, as people who study Christianity and the Bible, we see the Trinity as three distinct things. And Jesus Christ as the second person of the Trinity is only one of those three. But here what Dante is visualizing for us is that the figure of Jesus Christ as the personification of the divinity of all three persons coming together. And so within these circles is Christ himself, and all around him are rainbows. And finally, the Divine Comedy ends with Dante explaining these circles fitting together and how the humanity of Jesus and the humanity of Christ is related to the divinity of the second person of the Trinity. But in this moment, as we finish with the entire Divine Comedy, as we have reached the destination, everything that we've been doing this entire year, everything we've been doing for the past 2 years, has led up to this point. We have reached our telos. We are now face to face with our telos. So what do we do in this moment? What do we do when we reach the destination? We'll end this class, we'll end this year with the very last words of Dante's Paradiso. So I searched that strange sight. I wished to see the way in which our human effigy suited the circle and found place in it. I wished to see how our human person, how we as human beings, created in the image and likeness of God, where do we fit within these three circles? Where do we find our place in it? And I realized I was far too weak to understand it. But then my mind was struck by light that flashed. And with this light, my mind received what it had asked. In a moment, with the snap of a fingers, I understood it all. Here force failed my high fantasy. Anything that I could write in the lines of this poem would not be able to capture what I came to understand in that moment. But my desire and will were already moved, like a wheel, moving uniformly by the love that moves the sun and the other stars.